Hello and welcome to the Sigma Psi Distinguished Lectureship Series. I'm Katie Burke, Digital Features Editor at American Scientist. I'm speaking today with Ed Hackett, who joins us from Brandeis University, where he is Vice Provost of Research. Ed has studied the social structure of scientific organizations that excel at producing innovative research. Ed, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
For those who are watching this Google Hangout live, you can submit questions for Ed on the right side of your screen. You'll see a chat window where you can submit questions, a Q&A section. If you don't see a spot there, you can also type them on the event page, or you can go to Twitter and use the hashtag #AmSciGHO. So Ed has written a chapter in a book that will come out later this year called Innovation in Science and Organizational Renewal. And so we're going to be discussing some of the information that he's written about in that book. So before we get into the study, your study, Ed, of the organization of recent research synthesis centers, you've also done some interesting research on the history of scientific organizations since science's earliest days. So, for example, in Renaissance Italy, tell me about what was the vision for an optimal scientific organization at that time, and in what ways was it successful or not?
Well, let me just back up half a step. One of the reasons to look historically is that it's very easy to think that things always were and always must be just as they are today. Human life is short, and we tune things to our lifespan. We think that is how things ought to be. If you take a historical perspective, you start to realize that there's been a tremendous amount of change in the way we organize scientific research. Early 17th century science, you're thinking about Renaissance Italy and a little later, science, at least as it was imagined, would be interdisciplinary venture for the betterment of all humanity. The research center that was imagined would have a central locus in Rome and distributed offices in other parts of the world where it would bring together diverse scholars, except, interestingly, members of the church. The clergy were not welcome, to do what we would today call use-inspired fundamental research. So realizing that it has such a long history makes us think a bit more flexibly about its present and future.
And so how was the scientific organization at that time? How is it successful or not within society?
Well, I mean, ironically, the place I'm thinking of, the Accademia dei Lincei in Rome, was crashingly unsuccessful. Its founder tragically died young, but before that, it attracted a fair amount of negative attention from the church, which is, even for a member of the aristocracy, a bad deal in Rome of the day. But interestingly, Galileo was a member of this organization, so it had a good scientific pedigree. The other organizations from the 17th century that I talk about in the paper were more imaginary than real, such as Solomon's House, as Bacon imagined it in the New
Francis
Atlantis.
Bacon.
Yes. And what's interesting there is that, unlike the Lincei and some other imaginings of science at the time, he sequestered science from society, both by positioning it on the periphery of his utopian community and by placing it under the control of what amounted to a brotherhood or a priesthood that would keep scientific knowledge to itself and decide when to share with the leadership of the community and when actually to keep things among themselves and private.
Why was it called Solomon's House?
I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I don't know. I think it was echoing Solomon, a place of wisdom.
Uh-huh.
It would be a place where empirically grounded wisdom would emerge.
So these both these utopian visions of scientific organizations, as well as the real one of Academy of the Links, the one that was established in Rome. Um, I'm not going to try my hand at the Latin version of Academy of the Links. Um, but how are these successful or not? What did they tell us about what lessons do they hold for the structuring of research organizations within society?
Well, I think that's where we sort of leap to the conclusions. But what happened is science has since migrated to a variety of forms. And the one we're most familiar with is university-based investigator-initiated science, which, as folks following it know, has for the past perhaps 20 years been increasingly turned to be more engaged with um, fundamental societal needs, increasing health, well-being, and security. And if you follow congressional discussions of science, sport, and policy, um, those have been increasingly emphasized in the appropriations language and in other congressional engagement with the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation. So what we're seeing is a return to the engaged science that was initially imagined by Chasey, the Academy of the Links. But in between, I mean, the organizations that exist today that I use as inspiration for the paper are synthesis centers that were created at the imagining of scientists living today with um, wise support from scientific funding agencies such as NSF, State of California, other organizations.
Um, so I think you're a little bit too far from the mic. Could you get a little bit closer to your computer
Sure.
just so that maybe people will be able to hear you a little bit better?
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay. Um, so fast forward all the way through the Enlightenment to the 20th century, and science grew and differentiated into disciplines, as you said, and matured into a profession. And you've written about this particular talk by Max Weber in 1918, and you called it a quote watershed moment in the transformation, meaning science's transformation. So tell me about what Weber said and what that tells us about science in the 20th century compared to these visions by Bacon and CC, who came up with the idea of the Academy of the Links in 17th century visions of science.
Okay, so Max Weber was invited by students at the University of Munich to speak on two topics on successive nights: science as a vocation and politics as a vocation. And in Weber's mind, these were quite distinct spheres. And in Science as a Vocation, which is an essay I ask every graduate student I work with to read, Weber lays out a stirring vision of science that is at the same time chilling. And this is why I call it a watershed. The stirring part is that what he means by a calling or a vocation is a calling to the priesthood of something that moves the spirit, moves the soul. The essay is full of these expressions of utter engagement with the scientific task. Unless you believe that the fate of your soul depends upon making the correct conjecture at this juncture in this manuscript, you have no calling for science. But at the same time he's saying that, he's talking about science as this passionate pursuit. He also warns quite darkly of the quasi-proletarian existence that the scientists would live in state capitalist institutes of science or medicine. And what he means by state capitalist, the places where the scientist is dependent upon the state, the national government, to provide the resources needed to do science. So science moves from being the pursuit of wealthy gentlemen in their spare time when people are calling science toward being a profession that is done by people who rely upon it to make a living and rely upon the state to fund that living. That the institution itself is is fundamentally transformed. And I think that we live in the far side of that watershed, the side where the calling of science is in eclipse, and it's increasingly being tightly coupled to social purposes. Points I made earlier about the way science is funded today, and the way universities are dependent upon federal research support to manage their research efforts.
So what do you see as the bridge between these 17th century visions of science and the present day scientific enterprise, where you see this watershed as being this transition? What's that you're seeing? Why are you bringing up these 17th century visions now for your scholarship?
Well, I think that it is first an exercise to loosen the imagination. So you realize that the questions we're wrestling with now are questions people have wrestled with for hundreds of years. How should we organize science most appropriately to accomplish the social purposes before us, intellectual challenges we want to meet? That a variety of ways of organizing our research is possible. And that there is a bit of a circle being closed here, where in some of the arrangements for research that we talk about as most effective today, we see research coupled to social needs in ways that involve diverse publics informing science, even participating as researchers with science, this citizen science, public science component, where science becomes somewhat less mysterious. It becomes something that more people can involve themselves in. And so I think that it's again, an aid to the imagination, a relaxer that relaxes your thinking, rather than believing that we have this one way of organizing research and we have to cling to it desperately. And I think it brings us to think in a more fruitful way about the potential social purposes of science. If you, again, I'm leaping sort of to the conclusions of the chapter. If you want a really old reference, I sometimes remind people that when Aristotle was discussing the cardinal virtues of the good life, the first two are episteme, techne, or systematic knowledge, science, and art, craft, or technology. But we forget the third of those cardinal virtues that's essential to the triad, and that is phronesis, or situational right conduct, knowing the right thing to do today, here, now, these circumstances. And we need to build ways of conducting research, doing science, that rest upon this very sturdy tripod of the pursuit of knowledge and its application, both guided by a sense of the right thing to do in this situation at this moment. And I want to say quickly, I'm not the first person to think that phronesis deserves more attention today. Both the philosopher Martha Nussbaum and the social scientist Bent Lievgren have resurrected the Aristotelian idea and updated it to contemporary circumstance. And as I read their work, I saw its connection. These ways that we're organizing science. I think we should build it right into the bricks and mortar of our research.
So you've studied two ecological research organizations in detail that both came into being in the mid-90s. The National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis is one, and the Resilience Alliance is another. So why did you choose to study these two organizations? What are they?
Well, they're quite different. And I should say that I've had throughout this research a very close and quite brilliant colleague, John Parker, the professor now at Arizona State University, who wrote his dissertation on the Resilience Alliance. He was deeply embedded with that organization for a number of years, and he continues his connection with them and with the NCES, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. So I want to acknowledge John's great work in this area and his work on group creativity that he has published separately. Why these two groups? Well, to be very honest, because Nancy Grimm at ASU, a colleague when I was there in the early 90s, said to me, if you're interested in studying collaboration, you really got to talk to these people up at NCES in Santa Barbara, because what they're doing is really cool. And at the time, I had a grant from NSF to study scientific collaboration. I studied it in a variety of more traditional settings. And I set aside a little time and a little money from that grant to go meet folks at NCES and spend some time really just observing. And as Yogi Berra told us, you can observe a lot by just watching. And so I watched for a while and really recognized this was something quite different. The connections to the Resilience Alliance sort of followed from that, because there's a loose affiliation of membership between the two. And then John really lit upon the RA, embedded himself there, a number of their meetings. The organizations are quite different. NCES is a physical place on Main Street in Santa Barbara, on State Street, right in the center of Santa Barbara. The Resilience Alliance is a network of collaborating researchers with a center and a periphery. And that network meets occasionally for intensive research and theorizing. So they really were opportunistic. And so in some sense, this was a case of serendipity. I had the grant, Grimm pointed me in the right direction, and when I got to Santa Barbara, Jim Richmond, the director of NCES at the time, an ecologist, was very welcoming and wide open. He said, study us, I'll show you the documents, read the proposals, read the reviews, understand who we are and what we do.
And so introduce each in turn a little bit. Like, what does each do? What's their purpose? And then kind of how are they similar and different in their goals, their funding, their organizational structures?
That's a lot to say, but I'll say a little of it. So the core activity at NCES is the working group, which is self-organized, interdisciplinary. So a person has an idea for a kind of research that needs to be done, will entail synthesis. I guess I need to say what synthesis is. Motivating the creation of NCES is the idea that ecological knowledge is too dispersed. It's too place-based. Ecology is traditionally a place-based science, where you might study your forest and I would study mine, you have your lake, I have my stream. To move the science forward, folks decided that what was needed was a higher level integration of results. Bring data together from many lakes, many streams, many prairies, and assemble a larger scale data set from these smaller scale sets of observations, analyze them across the data synthetically, to look for broader scale laws and principles and underlying theories. So the example I talk about a lot is a problem that arose in the Eastern Pacific fishery, where in the early days of fisheries management, they noticed that when species was dying out, if you simply stopped fishing it, then the stuff it ate proliferated, and the stuff that species ate diminished, because you knocked the food web out of balance. And so this group met to develop a food web science-based program for fisheries management. And it included experts in every one of the species in the fishery, experts in modeling, experts in the primary productivity that would drive or bring the bottom of the food chain into the environment. As I said, expert modelers, and even a brand new PhD from UCLA who was an expert in birds, because when certain species hunt, they drive their prey up to the surface and the birds birds hit on them. They wanted to include that in the model. And then the way this group operated was they had a food web model that they input parameters to. They developed these parameters, found them from published sources. Sometimes they adjusted them when they saw either a result that they didn't believe, or when they looked at the projection of the model. They said, no, that can't be right. Look at that, that thing's eating everything. Let's reduce that parameter by half. And so it was a really interesting example of sort of forage feeding of scientific results through a production process with an evaluation system that we came to call peer review on the fly, which was that explanations were proposed and questioned, and revised, and updated, and adjusted in real time. In one instance, in a different group, we observed something like 50 critical exchanges, the comment, the criticism, the response, and improvement and adjustment. 50 of these in the space of about an hour. And what you saw with that was not only a very high velocity of research, where knowledge was being proposed, adjusted, vetted, corrected, settled at a very high rate, but you also saw a very emotionally intense experience. At one point, one of the members said, "Stop that or I'll stab you with this pen," in jest, but maybe only half in jest. And there was a real intensity of emotion in the room. And we came to realize that that intensity of emotion is itself a phenomenon important to the process of science. And you see, now this harks back to Weber's science as a calling, as a vocation, where you become engaged in it rather than do it simply as a job 9 to 5 that you check out from. And that this form of collaboration, these working groups in this synthesis center, promoted that intensity of collaboration in a way that we weren't seeing elsewhere. It happened that at the time we were also on the regular NSF grant studying fusion energy research, tokamaks, which are magnetic devices for containing the plasma and ideally creating fusion energy. Stay tuned, hoping it will happen. And we realized that what we were observing in these working groups was much like a fusion reaction, where the challenge was to create a plasma, to create this extra state of social existence, keep it isolated from the vessel walls, keep people from being distracted by the surroundings, cause interactions to occur that are hot, dense, and enduring, so that you could get past what physicists call the electrostatic force, the resistant force on the surface, to the nuclear force, which drew people together. And that nuclear force is what comes into play when people get over the fact that, well, you're an economist and I'm a sociologist and this is a psychologist, and we all work at different scales with different epistemic principles. And we realize that we've got this really important, cool, challenging problem before us that is going to take the best ideas we have, regardless of our disciplinary origins or the disciplinary foundations of the people we're working with. And again, it was really much like a fusion reaction, where you had to have the right stuff, the right context, inject energy, keep it long, dense, enduring, and you have this emergent phenomenon that might be self-sustaining.
That's a cool metaphor that nuclear fusion is analogous to what academics and researchers do when they come together and have powerful ideas.
And what's cooler, even, was that we were inspired by this through observation, and we talked about it just as informally as I did. And then, of course, like good scientists, we began to read the literature and figure out what's the context for these ideas, what can we make of them. And we read several people's theories of creativity. Randall Collins, sociologist, Risa Amabile, psychologist, organizations, business scholar. And we distilled the ideas in their work to resources, energy, context, and dynamics. And it's a longer lecture than you want to hear, but those map pretty closely on the things that they talk about. And we realized that this synthesis center, and in its own way, the Resilience Alliance, were creating those conditions. The sources were the access to data, analytic tools, the scientific knowledge that the people in the room brought. The energy or motivation was this emotional intensity and commitment to the problem. The context was this context that kept away the distractions, but also built in the group mutual trust and even intimacy, so that people felt comfortable sharing their ideas, trusting that others would evaluate them fairly, would not criticize them cruelly, would give them credit for them, wouldn't run off with the idea elsewhere. And finally, that the right dynamics were in place. So we found empirically that we got to systematically sound ideas. Sorry. Go ahead.
It's okay. So it was also quite successful too. I mean, NCEAS is among the top 1% most cited ecological research organizations. So they were coming up with widely recognized good research, right?
Yeah, by making this,
yeah,
actually several moves to bring the data together and looking for these larger scale principles, the science of ecology has been transforming itself, both intellectually and in the culture, a more collaborative culture. And collaborative in a different way.
So
yes, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry. We have this is going to kind of take us in a different direction a little bit, but we have a question from the audience. What about the idea that scientists are the ones to ostracize others if they differ from accepted opinion? And that kind of gets to some of the work you talk about, just interpersonal dynamics.
That is true. It is something that we point to in the work we have done with both of these groups, that to the extent that a group depends upon strong in-group bonds, strong solidarity, there is a real risk of groupthink, of tuning out inconvenient other ideas. And the challenge is creating enough portals so that those ideas can get in. We address this in our thinking, and this isn't a pat answer to that question at all. That's a really good question. But the fourth of the four conditions that we talk about are dynamics. Now, this is what the individual level creativity scholars, Teresa Amabile, for example, think of as the creative processes that make a talented person really perform well. And by that, she means things like your risk tolerance, your boldness, your imagination. At the group level, we thought of this as having the right kinds of dynamics. And looking at the group literature on science, what we learned is that there's reason to think that science depends upon managing an ambivalence or a tension between competing values. This is an idea I've been working with in different ways for about 25 years. But that in science, say in Thomas Kuhns' view of science, the research enterprise is characterized by what he calls the essential tension, fundamental tension of science, originality and tradition. But that there are many other tensions we've learned that characterize science. And for example, the tension between being open and closed, having a certain amount of closure protects ideas in the nurturing stages. This is also kind of the context of discovery or brainstorming, where you would say, let's propose ideas uncritically. But then if you stop there, you have a real risk of groupthink and really biased thinking, which is why you also then need to have the complementary value to this ambivalence of openness, the critical phase, which is where these inconvenient ideas must not be excluded, but must be brought in and brought to challenge.
Yeah, that there needs to be room for wild ideas, but also then skepticism to vet them after a while.
And the crucial dynamic is to manage that ambivalence and allow both at the side. And I should also attribute that idea to Don Peltz and Frank Andrews in 1966. The idea is 50 years old and it's been sort of percolating out there.
So this kind of ties in with the question, the subject we're on. So you also have said that diversity in a group is important,
Yes.
but that there is such thing as too much diversity, and also that merely having diversity doesn't necessarily translate into an intellectual benefit. So what do you mean?
Yeah. Well, certain have simply having a diverse group, diverse in any way, diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, intellectual diversity, disciplinary diversity. We talk also of sectoral diversity, having people from science, from different agencies, and the public all present is a very valuable form of diversity. But simply having them in the room isn't sufficient. You also have to activate that expertise. You have to have a context in which everyone feels free to speak and their ideas are listened to and taken seriously. And you can't create that context. You lose the expertise that's in the room. And in some work we've done, look at that. We have asked people in collaborations to wear sociometric sensor badges that monitor when and how much they're speaking. And so we can look at the time traces of who's speaking when and see if certain voices are silent and others are dominating. And there's some evidence that groups perform better. They perform above their talent level, if you will, if they achieve balance in the patient of all members. Typically, such groups are hard to create and maintain, but that it turns out that when such groups are led by or are predominantly composed of women, they tend to be more balanced than if you have a male-led, male-dominated.
Wow.
And that's Anita Willie Williams' work published in Science, October 2010. So I don't claim that result, but I find it to work. It did use those badges.
So you also you've mentioned that there's these tensions that need to be maintained, that need to be in balance. You know, Thomas Kuhn is famous for saying that the tension between originality and tradition is important, but that there are lots of other traditions, as you said, tensions, as you said. So you also talk some about the balance between egalitarianism or the liberty to question authority and hierarchy, and what do you see as the best balance of these social structures in the innovative groups that you've observed?
Well, actually, what I've discovered in the work I've done on groups is that there is no best balance. The key is actually not looking for the ideal mean, but being able to move along that dimension as circumstances require. And again, I don't claim any originality for that. It's in Pelton Andrews' 1966, and I've sort of unearthed it again, and then I found it to be so in some groups I've studied. So I can point to groups I've studied where the lab director says, this is no democracy. There is one way in this lab, and it's my way. One very famous scientist was known for being willing to throw down the drain in the experiment that he didn't personally approve. Yet I've had other very successful groups that operate by allowing a fair amount of divergence in what's done. And in the paper, in one of the synthesis centers, we observed a group where senior people were telling the junior people that it would be a waste of time to conduct a particular analysis. It had to do with plotting body mass, metabolic rate for various plants and animals across the whole spectrum, from shrews to whales, from lichen to redwoods. And it turns out that among animals and among plants, there's lawful relations. And these young people were saying, well, why don't we plot these together? And the senior scientist was saying, that'd be crazy, it'd be stupid, don't bother. It kept pushing the work in another direction. The group broke for lunch. Undaunted, the couple of the young scholars got together and did what they had been forbidden to do, and show this senior guy and the rest of the room the result. And suddenly, the room was full of holy, unrepeatables and laws of nature by God, and the line is very clearly traced for plants and animals across all scales. Um, One of the people in the room used it in his MacArthur lecture. So a very important finding emerges from what turned out to be a very fruitful tension between senior and scholars.
So another tension that you talk about, and it's one that can be quite tense in science, is the tension between theory and application, which both NCEAS and the Research Alliance were designed to try to tackle that interface between theory and application. So what have you observed about how these organizations have gone about navigating that particular tension?
Well, it turns out not to be an either or, but a both and. In other words, the goal is to use the inspiration of use in order to stimulate new thinking that can lead to fundamental scientific ideas. And so one example is work on marine protected areas that was led by Jane Lubchenco over a series of several years, several meetings of a very large working group that published many scientific papers that provided new insights into the dynamics of MPAs, but also led to the design of MPAs in the water in the Pacific off the coast of St. Martin.
And by MPAs, you meaning marine protected areas.
Yeah,
just want to make sure people are following.
Right.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about how important emotional investment is for these organizations, that there's a certain amount of intense energy that these organizations foster, and that is essential for intellectual fusion. How do these organizations foster that emotional energy? Like, what are some of the things they actually do? How are they structured?
Well, I think part of the answer is in the first question you asked, the one before, which is by having a practical application in view. A marine protected area, fisheries management, maybe new principles for protecting marine mammals. You lend urgency to the occasion so that it's not just, well, let's see if we can figure this out and write a paper someday, but it's that there's a species threatened, or there's a pressing need in the world that our research can address, and we better get down to it. And again, as with many of these ideas, this is one I claim no originality for, but Gerald Gordon, a sociologist of science, a generation older than I am, talked about how urgency and visibility of consequences, being able to see that the results of your research will make a real difference in the world, and that there's some urgency, some real time pressure to do it. But these two qualities were qualities that promoted creativity in group collaborations. This work was done more than 40 years ago. I knew Jerry as one of my professors when I was a grad student at Cornell. He was on the committee. So I learned this from him, and the ideas always stuck at the back of my mind. And it reappears then in the ideas of, say, Pasteur's quadrant, that what Jerry had said at first, I think, that the inspiration of use can drive collaboration in creative and powerful ways. And so I think some of these groups keep the ends in view. What else? I think that
Well,
the level of trust.
one thing
Sorry. Yes.
That's what I was going to get at. Yep.
Yeah, I think that establishing trust, which is a multi-stage process, group formation, is vital. And I think I mentioned this quickly before, but we talk about trust as if it's an undifferentiated thing when it's got many aspects. In these groups, the first aspect is that you're trusting others to know what they're talking about. You're trusting their expertise, so that you would say, well, you're the dryland ecologist. I'm a physical geographer. I defer to your expertise on this. And this room has maybe a dozen or 15 of us, each relying on the expertise of another to fill in the critical part of the intellectual puzzle. But that's not the only trust that's important. A second form of trust develops, which is the trust that I can propose an idea and you'll treat me gently. If you think it's wrong, you will tell me, but you won't tell me in a cruel way, so that it will be. I won't have to preface everything I say by, well, this may be stupid, but. And that eventually frees you to think, across disciplines, outside your discipline, in a way you can't if you think that you're going to be stifled, criticized harshly for your ignorance. A third sort of trust is kind of an odd critical trust. It's the complement of what I just mentioned, which is that I trust you to criticize me if my idea is wrong. I mean, don't let me say something stupid for very long. Don't be harmful, but set us on the right track. So I'm trusting that you're engaged in this conversation and want a sound outcome from it, for this collaboration, and that I'll trust you to criticize my ideas gently, but to criticize them. And fourthly, I trust this to be our shared intellectual property, so that if someone in the room says something that's worth following up, we'll follow it up together, rather than have it wander out of the room and become the core focus of someone else's lab. So unless you have those conditions of trust, it's very difficult to get the free-flowing open participation that leads to this sort of escalating intimacy, as people in the trade call it, that then brings out the best in people, where the shields go down and you actually start to approach the condition that people talk about as flow, or in this case, group flow, where as one person in the Resilience Alliance described it, it was almost as if this group that was working one evening was a single mind, a single soul that was thinking, but it was 6 individual minds that were in some ways in harmony, producing ideas that no one of them could have done alone. But no one of them also could have really attributed responsibility to the ideas in quite the way complex adaptive system people mean it, emerged from the interaction of these people on that porch that evening, in that place. And the challenge is to create more such environments.
Right. So how do these organizations actually foster those bonds and make sure that everybody feels trusted and can create these bonds? What is unique about the organizations that are actually achieving group flow and achieving intellectual fusion versus the organizations that tend not to?
Well, I don't have a complete answer to that. I've got some ideas. We have some ideas, I should say. Again, John Parker is a major part of this collaboration. And I share these ideas. I think that some of it is building a climate of trust a bit at a time, so that these meetings often start by what John calls people showing the marker, or you've probably seen this. You go around the room and each individual in 5 minutes is who they are, what they're working on, what they think they're going to contribute. And these little 5-minute, and I see they've crept up in some places 10-minute talks, are like calling cards, but it's a chance to show people what you bring and who you are. So that develops the trust in people's competence. Um, Other sorts of trust emerge as the group starts to see itself as a group, as not just a collection of individuals. Some groups did this by isolating themselves. The Resilience Alliance, for example, meets every 18 months, roughly, you know, on an island, sometimes literally, sometimes not literally, but isolated enough from regular environments that it acts like so in the middle of a game preserve, for example, so that it's as if you're now free of the environment that gives you these contextual cues. Some of those cues are cues that bring about what may be counterproductive behavior, such as the senior professor junior grad student interaction that can squelch smart criticisms or bright new ideas. But if you move those people out of the academic setting to an island or to, in the case of NCs, it's in an office building in downtown Santa Barbara. It is deliberately not on the UCSB campus, part of UCSB. And the idea is that then discourages people to come to a working group and then to wander the halls looking for this friend, that colleague, or a relative that they'd like to have coffee with or a chat. Instead, you're 10 miles from the campus. You're here for this purpose. And the NC's environment is kind of a soft corporate environment. So it's not the university environment. It gets people out of their settled roles. It makes it easier for a senior scientist to refer to a junior one. All of the contextual cues that make senior and junior what they are. Yes. Some of the groups also use gimmicks, like one group would refuse to work unless it had M&Ms. And so that was just a sense of, an expression of its groupness. Others would go out and drink together. So this is the phrase we use, we even got a picture that goes with it from the Resilience Alliance, is sort of full body contact. Not meant in any offensive way, but the sense that you were dealing with one another as whole people rather than simply as professionals. The Resilience Alliance accomplishes this by inviting you to bring your family, a spouse, significant other, I think even children. And you might think that this is a distraction, but what it does is it lets people know one another as whole individuals in their variety of roles, not just as, the gal who's here to bring expertise of ocean fish, of ocean predatory fish, say, to this working group. But, you've got this partner and that child, and it turns out you like to play tennis and you enjoy IPAs, and get to know one another in a more complete sense, which then helps build the trust and build the. See, with the trust, you get these ideas and criticisms. The interaction, the social interaction, escalates and becomes more intense. People sort of lose track of who they are, and they're simply thinking.
Let's see. I want to make sure I've asked all the. We're getting towards the end, so I want to make sure I've asked all the questions I feel like really need to be asked.
I'll sneak in something that I really like to say, which is that
Yeah.
I don't want to be peddling a model saying the Resilience Alliance or a synthesis center is the way to do that. But what I'd like to say is that those are examples that seem to embody these principles that we can then bring to bear from social and psychological theory. This idea of resources, energy, context, and dynamics rest upon a pretty sizable body of research that like Dean Simonton and Randall Collins and Teresa Amelie, and certainly others, names I'm forgetting, Elton Matthews for their scientists organization work. So that there's sort of a from the bottom up empirical observation sense that in the places that we've looked, these are principles that lead to productive research, science. And then from kind of the top down, from theory and more established and in other contexts, empirical work of scholars I've mentioned, that we can see these abstract qualities, sources, energy, constants, dynamics, that lead to creativity. And so what I'm trying to do is get attention to the principles and to support the principles by empirical examples from the places that I've studied, albeit a little. So I'm not saying both RAs or synthesis centers everywhere because they do everything they need, but to attend to these principles and find your collaboration.
Right. And also, as you're watching, science funding has been in decline. NC's has lost its funding, correct?
Yeah, NSF support.
Is it closed or is it?
It still exists. It's got support from Conservancy, I believe, and I think from some other place. No, so it still exists. It's changed form a little bit. The loss of NSF support is no dishonor. NSF's principle is it funds nothing forever. And in fact, it funded NC's 3 different times, which is extraordinary. Seldom does NSF fund more than a second phase, the second 5 years of an enterprise. And NC's was so successful it got a third 5-year award to operate. So, and other synthesis centers elsewhere in the US and elsewhere in the world. But again, I am not peddling the form so much as saying that there's probably something, it's like drug discovery. We found these naturally occurring plants that seem to have a really useful protective quality. Let's see if we can identify, isolate, and produce in other places those qualities. And theory then guides us to what the qualities might be, and that's where we have, at least at the moment, categorize them as resources, energy, and those dynamics are the
And so,
yes, sir.
And so, what about some small changes that science organizations can make today to help? That if we not only do we need these new institutions or temporary synthesis centers that tackle a specific problem that's theoretical and applied, but also just how can smaller organizations also just take home some of these ideas about creating innovation and make some small changes that could help scientists at their organizations do better?
Well, I like the tripod. So I think that emphasizing that science and technology should be complemented by this sense of situational right conduct. So that means that there's a place in the education of scientists and engineers for learning in the domains of the humanities and social sciences and arts, and to develop a more full intellect, and particularly to guide the conduct of research and innovation, not at the high scale of the categorical imperative of Kant and others, but at the scale of what should I do here now in this context, or better, how can I learn what the right thing to do might be here now in this context? And I think that this emphasis on linking knowledge, its application, and the sense of the right way to do it, for me, could also draw underrepresented groups, members of underrepresented groups, into science, education, technology education, more than they've been drawn in the past, because it prepares one to intervene successfully on the ground in places that matter. There's evidence that that form of innovation is very important to people as they're choosing careers in science or medicine. The other thing is to create places where scientific interaction can happen away from the usual content, to bring people out of their customary roles, our different roles, which is possible if you have a retreat that's literally a retreat. These days, at least on the college campuses that I've been on, a retreat means a long meeting with maybe coffee and donuts. It used to mean we're actually going to go off campus, out of our roles, out of our day-to-day work, where we might hike or have music and think in quite a different way than we used to think about stuff that matters. And so restoring some of that might be a way to restart that sense of trust and escalating intimacy that deep intellectual engagement, fusion, innovation.
So what forms of organizational institutional innovation do you see on the horizon emerging in science and ecology that you have your eye on right now that are interesting you?
That's a great question. And I don't know what's emerging. I haven't thought about it. So I'm just going to say I don't know. I'd have to actually look and see what new forms of. Certainly, a lot of attention is being given now to using information and computer technology, ICT, or cyber-enabled collaboration. One of the early versions of the work we've done on synthesis centers was published in a book about science on the internet. And the finding there, which I think is still a durable finding, is that effective collaboration in a distance is enhanced by collaboration in person. That what you want is an oscillation between intensive periods of work face to face and cyber-mediated distal search. So centers, places that have that quality, that make richer use of the technology that we're using now, are probably on the horizon, and they're increasingly important as they use that technology to engage various members of the public, the various publics that would care about any particular science issue. So one place that we have, my colleagues and I here, I'm thinking about Hallie Aiken, who's a professor in the Sustainability School at ASU, and some colleagues in the STEP Center at Sussex, are using ideas from synthesis centers to think about ways to create more effective collaborations or sustainability in developing countries, so that you would find synthesis center-like arrangement that would bring the expertise from the North and the West to engage that the lesser developed countries in the global South, with full respect for the varieties of expertise that are being brought in the local, tacit, sentient knowledge of people in the place, so that you're not privileging Western, Northern, formal knowledge, but really trying to unsettle it, so that just as in the fusion of the synthesis centers, the initial "we know better, you don't know it all" will tell you is brushed past. You get to the point where people really work closely to try to address the wicked challenges of here again, I'm thinking of sustainable development, in particular, how you improve the lot of people in developing countries without, tilting those countries into unsustainable. So, I mean, that's actually an emerging organizational form that I am keeping my eye on. It helped to start some thinking in that direction with Hallie and our STEP Center colleagues, Sterling, Adrian, Eli.
Well, it's all sounds very fascinating. Thank you so much for talking with us, and good luck with your research. The chapter that Ed wrote is in the book Innovation in Science and Organizational Renewal, which comes out later this year. Ed, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Good luck with the research.
Good luck with
Thanks. Bye-bye.